At exactly 9:42 p.m., a tired father stood in his small kitchen holding his work jacket, frozen by a question his child had asked only minutes before. If no one sees you do something wrong, does it still matter? That question followed him out the door, down the dim hallway, and into the long night ahead. He was a single dad, the kind who memorized school schedules better than his own sleep cycle, the kind who measured life in paychecks and promises. Every night he chose work that fit around his child, not the other way around. This shift was supposed to be simple, quiet, and forgettable. No heroics, no attention, just another invisible job done while the rest of the city slept. People like him were expected to keep things running, not to ask questions. They were supposed to follow routines, trust the system, and go home. But routine has a way of hiding the most dangerous truths. And silence, when repeated often enough, starts to feel like permission. That night was not about ambition, recognition, or reward. It was about a man carrying a child's question into a workplace built on assumptions and shortcuts. He didn't walk in planning to challenge anything. He walked in wanting to earn enough to keep the lights on and be there in the morning. Yet somewhere between the hum of machines and the ticking of time, he would be forced to choose between survival and self-respect. This is not a story about power or wealth or dramatic rescues. It is a story about a single father, an ordinary job, and the quiet moment when doing the right thing becomes the hardest shift of all. The building never slept, but it pretended to. That was the first thing he noticed when he clocked in for the night shift. The lights stayed on, the machines hummed, the monitors blinked in quiet rhythm, yet the place felt hollow, as if it was only playing the role of being awake. During the day, hundreds of people passed through these halls without ever thinking about what kept everything running. At night, it was just him, a handful of systems, and the soft, relentless ticking of time. He hung his jacket on the back of the chair and sat down at the narrow desk assigned to him. The chair wobbled slightly, one leg shorter than the others, and he made a mental note to be careful not to lean too far back. Little things like that mattered when you couldn't afford to get hurt. No sick days, no backup income. Just a paycheck that barely stretched far enough to cover rent, groceries, and the growing list of school expenses waiting at home. This job wasn't impressive. It didn't come with a title that sounded important or a badge that made people nod with respect. Officially, he was a night operations attendant, responsible for monitoring equipment, logging routine checks, and reporting anything out of the ordinary. In reality, most nights passed without incident. People before him had learned how to make themselves invisible, how to blend into the background until morning came. He understood why. When you were a single father, invisibility could feel like safety. He powered on the terminal and logged into the system using the same shared credentials everyone used. The password hadn't been changed in years. No one worried about security on the night shift. They worried about whether anyone would even show up. He glanced at the shift log from the previous night. Short entries, copy-pasted phrases, all systems normal, no issues detected. The same words repeated over and over, like a lullaby meant to soothe management rather than reflect reality. He told himself this wasn't his concern. He was here to do his hours, follow instructions, and go home in one piece. His daughter would be asleep when he returned, her backpack already packed for the next day, her shoes lined neatly by the door the way she liked them. She trusted that he would always come back. That trust weighed on him more heavily than any responsibility listed in his job description. The first hour passed quietly. He walked the assigned route, checked the required panels, scanned the same barcodes others had scanned before him. Everything appeared normal, at least on the surface. Green lights, stable readings, no alarms. The kind of calm that encouraged complacency. Still, something about the place made him uneasy. It wasn't fear, exactly. more like the feeling you got when a room was too quiet, when the absence of sound made you notice your own breathing. He paused near one of the larger monitoring screens, watching numbers scroll by in neat columns. Temperatures, pressures, flow rates, data that meant nothing to most people, but represented the fragile balance holding everything together. He remembered what his supervisor had said during the rushed orientation earlier that evening. Don't overthink it. If it's green, it's good. If it's red, call someone. Simple. The man had already been halfway out the door when he said it, eager to be done with the night shift for good. Simple was a luxury he didn't have. He checked his phone briefly, not for messages, but for reassurance. A photo of his daughter filled the screen. She was smiling, missing one of her front teeth, holding up a crooked drawing she'd proudly labeled Our Family. Just the two of them, drawn a little too close together, as if she was afraid the page might pull them apart. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a slow breath. This job mattered because it paid. That was supposed to be enough. As the night wore on, the building settled into its deepest rhythm. Fewer alerts, fewer automatic adjustments. Systems assumed nothing would change because nothing ever did. That assumption, he realized, was built into everything around him. The entire operation relied on yesterday being identical to today. He stopped at one terminal he hadn't been assigned to check yet, not because the schedule told him to, but because something about the data on the adjacent screen bothered him. One value lagged behind the others, only slightly, but enough to catch his attention. He leaned closer, squinting, refreshing the display. The number adjusted, then settled again just below where it should have been. Probably nothing, he told himself. Sensors drift. Calibration varies. That was what the training manual said. He opened the historical log anyway. The same value appeared there, repeated across weeks, then months, always within acceptable range, always just shy of the standard baseline. He scrolled further back, same pattern. No fluctuations, no annotations. That was odd. Systems didn't behave that consistently unless someone made them look that way. Natural variation left fingerprints, small spikes, dips, noise in the data. This was too smooth, too perfect in its imperfection. His stomach tightened. He glanced around the empty room, half expecting someone to tell him to mind his own business. No one came. The hum of the equipment filled the silence, indifferent to his unease. He thought about the advice he'd been given over the years at different jobs by different people who all meant the same thing. Don't be the guy who causes trouble. Trouble costs time, trouble costs money, trouble got contracts cut and names quietly removed from schedules. Trouble got single fathers replaced. He minimized the window and continued his route, telling himself he'd look again later if it still bothered him. But the thought followed him, nagging at the back of his mind. Each system he checked after that seemed less solid, less trustworthy, not broken, not failing, just unattended, like a house that hadn't been inspected in years because nothing bad had happened yet. By the middle of the shift, fatigue crept in, not the kind that made your eyes heavy, but the deeper exhaustion that came from carrying responsibility without authority. He sat down again, rubbed his temples, and stared at the screen. He imagined what would happen if he reported what he'd seen. Questions would be asked, logs reviewed, fingers pointed, and eventually someone would decide he had misunderstood the data, or worse, overstepped his role. Best case, he'd be ignored. Worst case, he'd be labeled a problem. He imagined the alternative too, signing the log, writing all systems normal, walking out at dawn as if nothing had caught his eye. That option felt easier, safer. He could already hear the rationalizations forming. It's not my job. Someone else is responsible. If it were serious, it would have failed by now. Yet the question from earlier that evening returned uninvited, spoken in a small, earnest voice. If no one sees you do something wrong, does it still matter? He hadn't answered then because he hadn't wanted to lie. He stood up and returned to the terminal. This time, he pulled up a deeper diagnostic menu, one rarely accessed and poorly documented. The system hesitated, then loaded. More data appeared, less polished, less filtered. And there it was, the same value, flagged internally as deferred, not resolved, not corrected, deferred. Deferred meant someone knew. He felt a chill run through him, not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't an accident or a glitch. It was a choice that had been made, documented, and quietly buried under layers of acceptable language. He checked the time. Still hours until morning. He thought of his daughter waking up, pouring cereal into a bowl too big for her hands, trusting that the world her father navigated each night was one that would not betray them both. He thought of how easily trust could be broken by small decisions made in quiet rooms. The building remained calm around him, unaware of the weight shifting inside one man who had not come in looking to make a difference. He had come in looking to survive. And now, without asking for it, survival was beginning to ask something back. By the time the clock crept past midnight, the building had settled into a deeper stillness, the kind that pressed inward rather than fading away. The discovery he had made refused to stay contained in the terminal where he'd found it. It followed him down corridors, hovered near his thoughts, and altered the way he looked at every indicator light and status panel he passed. What had once felt routine now felt rehearsed, as if the building itself were performing a version of normal that everyone had agreed not to question. He tried to focus on his assigned tasks. He really did. He checked off boxes, scanned codes, confirmed readings that fell neatly within acceptable ranges. Yet each confirmation felt hollow, like repeating a sentence whose meaning had quietly changed. He was no longer just verifying systems. He was verifying a narrative someone else had written for him. Eventually, he did what he knew he wasn't supposed to do. He asked a question. The first person he approached was a technician, finishing up a late task near one of the auxiliary stations. The man was older, with the relaxed posture of someone who had learned which corners could safely be cut and which ones couldn't. He listened without much expression as the single dad pointed out the data discrepancy, keeping his voice low, careful not to sound accusatory. The technician glanced at the screen, then shrugged. "Yeah, that thing's been like that forever." "That's normal?" he asked. "Normal enough." The man wiped his hands on a rag and turned away. "If it hasn't failed yet, it's not going to tonight." The answer landed with a dull thud. It wasn't denial, it wasn't concern, it was something worse, acceptance, as if the problem had been folded into the background noise of the job, stripped of its urgency through repetition. He pressed a little further, asking if anyone had logged a repair request or flagged it for review. The technician's shoulders stiffened. "Look," he said, not unkindly, "you're new. Don't make your life harder than it needs to be. Stuff like this gets handled when it gets handled." When he walked away, the hum of the machine seemed louder, more insistent. He felt foolish for expecting more, for hoping that simply pointing out the issue would trigger concern. Instead, it had triggered a warning, unspoken but clear. He wasn't done yet.
Later, during a scheduled check-in, he mentioned the anomaly to the shift supervisor. He framed it cautiously, emphasizing that he might be mistaken, that he was still learning the systems. The supervisor listened with the weary patience of someone who had heard too many similar concerns from people who didn't last long. "If it were critical," the supervisor said, tapping the clipboard with a pen, "it would already be flagged at a higher level." "It is flagged," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "Internally. As deferred." The pen stopped tapping. The supervisor looked up, studying him more closely now. "You planning to make this a problem?" The question wasn't hostile, it was practical. "I'm just trying to understand the risk," he said. The supervisor sighed. "The risk is always there. That's the nature of these systems. You want my advice?" He leaned closer. Do your job. Write your reports. Let the people above you worry about the rest. Above you. The phrase carried weight. It drew an invisible line he wasn't meant to cross. He nodded, thanked the supervisor, and walked away with his chest tight and his thoughts louder than ever. He hadn't been dismissed outright. He had been managed. Guided gently back into the lane reserved for people like him. The rest of the shift stretched ahead like a test of endurance. Every system check became a negotiation between what he knew and what he was expected to ignore. He found himself imagining outcomes, not dramatic disasters, but smaller failures that accumulated quietly until someone got hurt, or worse, until no one could pinpoint exactly when things had gone wrong. He wondered how many people had stood where he was standing now, noticed what he had noticed, and chosen silence. Not because they were careless, but because they were tired. Because they had families to support. Because the cost of speaking up was immediate and personal, while the cost of staying quiet was abstract and shared. At one point, he sat alone in the break room, staring at a coffee that had gone cold. He checked his phone again, this time reading a message his daughter had sent earlier in the evening before falling asleep. It was just a few words, spelled imperfectly, telling him she hoped his night was not too boring, and reminding him not to forget her school presentation later that week. The ordinariness of the message made his throat tighten. He thought about the advice someone had once given him after his wife died, back when everything still felt raw and unmanageable. Focus on what you can control. At the time, it had felt like wisdom. Now it felt like a trap. Because control, he was realizing, could easily become an excuse for indifference. He returned to the terminal and pulled up the data again, double-checking his conclusions. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Deferred actions, copied notes. A system designed to escalate concerns that had been systematically dulled by human convenience. No single villain, no dramatic cover-up, just a culture that rewarded smooth operations over uncomfortable truths. He considered documenting what he'd found, even if he didn't submit it. Just having a record felt like resistance. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. What would happen if this came back to him? He was a contractor, easily replaceable. There would be no long meetings, no formal reprimands. He simply wouldn't be scheduled again. His badge would stop working. Someone else would sit in his chair and inherit the same quiet dilemma. The thought of explaining that to his daughter made his stomach twist. Not the loss of income, that could be managed somehow, but the explanation itself. The story he would tell her about why he'd stopped going to that job. He imagined two versions of that conversation. In one, he told her the job ended, that sometimes things just didn't work out. In the other, he told her he'd seen something wrong and chosen not to look away, even though it scared him. One version was easier, the other felt true. The building around him gave no guidance. It continued to function, indifferent to his moral calculus. Systems adjusted automatically, compensating for weaknesses no one wanted to acknowledge. It struck him then that this was how larger failures happened, not through sudden collapse, but through countless small decisions to let things slide. He wasn't angry, that surprised him. He felt disappointed, yes, and tired beyond measure, but not angry. Anger implied surprise. This felt inevitable, like discovering that a door you'd always assumed was locked had been hanging open for years. At 2:30 a.m., he received a message from another worker on a different floor, asking if everything was good on his end. He typed back a neutral response. All good here. The lie felt heavier than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant echo of air moving through vents and ducts. He thought again of his daughter's question, how casually it had been asked, how deeply it had lodged itself inside him. Children had a way of cutting through complexity without realizing it. If no one sees you do something wrong, does it still matter? He realized then that the question wasn't really about being seen, it was about being known. Known by the person you were when no one was watching. The pressure of the choice ahead settled fully onto his shoulders. He could still walk away, still write the expected words in the log, and leave the rest to people who had more authority and more protection. No one would blame him. They would understand. They already did. But understanding didn't feel like absolution. He opened a new document and began to type, not submitting anything yet, just laying out the facts as clearly as he could. Data points, timestamps, internal flags, the truth stripped of drama. As he wrote, something inside him steadied. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became focused, directional. He wasn't making a grand stand. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was doing the only thing that allowed him to breathe without feeling like he was shrinking. Outside, the night deepened, unaware that one man, sitting quietly in an unremarkable room, was inching closer to a decision that would not make him a hero, but would make him accountable to himself. The silence around him remained intact. But it no longer felt neutral. It felt like a question waiting for an answer. By the time he realized he was past the point of pretending nothing was wrong, the decision had already begun to shape itself. It didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. There was no surge of courage, no internal speech about doing the right thing. Instead, it came quietly, assembling itself from smaller thoughts, smaller refusals to look away. The more clearly he saw the situation, the harder it became to imagine returning to the comfort of not knowing. He reread what he had typed so far. The document was plain, almost clinical. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts laid out in careful order. Dates, values, internal flags, deferred actions. It was the kind of report no one noticed unless they were looking for a reason to pay attention. And that, he suspected, was exactly the problem. He saved the file under a neutral name and leaned back in his chair. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened screen, older than he felt, more tired than he wanted to admit. He looked like a man who had learned to accept limits, who had adjusted his expectations downward in small increments until survival felt like success. This choice threatened that fragile balance. He stood and walked the length of the room, hands clasped behind his back, as if he were inspecting a space that suddenly felt too small. His mind replayed every warning he'd been given. Don't make waves. This isn't your responsibility. Think about your kid. They weren't wrong. That was the most unsettling part. The advice came from experience, from people who had learned how systems protected themselves by pushing risk onto the most vulnerable. He thought about how often responsibility was framed as hierarchy. If you were low enough on the ladder, you were expected to carry out instructions without questioning outcomes. Moral distance was built into the structure. The higher up decisions were made, the easier it was to believe they were abstract. But he was too close for abstraction now. He returned to the terminal and accessed a function few people used, one buried beneath layers of menus and disclaimers. It existed to escalate concerns that hadn't been addressed through routine channels. He'd seen it mentioned once in a manual no one read. A formal process, technically available to anyone with access, but quietly discouraged through culture rather than policy. His finger hovered over the trackpad. Initiating it wouldn't trigger alarms or draw immediate attention. It would, however, create a permanent record, a timestamp, a digital footprint tied unmistakably to his name. There would be no denying involvement, no plausible claim of ignorance. He imagined the morning after, a meeting he wouldn't be invited to, conversations he'd never hear, decisions made about him without him in the room. He imagined being called into an office, someone explaining with professional sympathy that his contract was no longer needed. He imagined his daughter's face if that happened. Then he imagined something else. A different kind of conversation, one where she asked him, years from now, what he did when he knew something was wrong, whether he had spoken up, even when it cost him. The weight of that future question pressed harder than the fear of immediate consequences. He initiated the process. The system responded with a series of confirmations, each one asking if he was sure. He read each prompt carefully, as if slowness might soften the impact. When it was done, the screen returned to its neutral state, offering no reaction, no validation. The building did not shudder, the lights did not flicker, nothing changed, and yet everything had. He added his report as an attachment, double-checking that it uploaded correctly. He included references, screenshots, internal identifiers. He wrote a brief summary, concise and unemotional, stating only what could be supported by data. When he finished, he sat still, listening to the low hum of machinery, feeling strangely calm. The calm didn't last. As the minutes passed, unease crept back in, sharper now that the choice had been made. He found himself scanning the room, half expecting someone to walk in, to ask what he thought he was doing. Every footstep in the distance made his shoulders tense. He had crossed an invisible line, and the uncertainty of what lay on the other side was exhausting. He continued his shift as normally as possible. He logged checks. He followed routes. He answered a brief call from another worker with the same neutral tone he'd practiced all night. On the surface, nothing about his behavior changed. Inside, everything felt exposed. At one point, he nearly deleted a line from the report, worrying it might be interpreted as overreach. He stopped himself. Editing the truth to make it more comfortable was just another form of silence. He left it as it was. Around 4:00 a.m., fatigue hit him hard. The adrenaline that had carried him through the decision faded, leaving behind a deep, aching weariness. He sat down and rested his head in his hands, breathing slowly, grounding himself in the present. The machines around him continued their steady work, indifferent to the moral drama playing out in a single human mind. He checked his phone again. No new messages. He imagined his daughter asleep, tangled in blankets, trusting the world to remain stable until morning. That trust, he realized, was fragile not because the world was dangerous, but because too many people relied on others to care more than they did. The rest of the shift passed without incident. No alarms, no calls, no immediate fallout. The building remained functional, efficient, composed. He almost wondered if he had exaggerated the importance of what he'd found, if the system would quietly absorb the report and move on without consequence. That possibility unsettled him more than punishment would have. As dawn approached, the darkness outside softened into gray. He completed his final checks, his movements automatic now. When he reached the logbook, he hesitated. For a moment, muscle memory urged him to write the expected phrase, to blend in one last time. Instead, he wrote a factual summary of the shift. Brief, accurate, unremarkable on its own, but honest. He signed his name with deliberate care, as if the clarity of the letters mattered. When his replacement arrived, they exchanged the usual nods. No one asked questions. No one sensed the weight he carried with him as he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The city was waking up, unaware that anything had been threatened or protected overnight. He walked to the bus stop, his body heavy, his mind restless. With each step, the reality of what he'd done settled more firmly into place. There would be consequences. Even if he couldn't see them yet, they were already in motion. At home, he let himself in quietly. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and toast from the night before. He set his keys down, careful not to make noise, and peeked into his daughter's room. She slept peacefully, her face relaxed, one arm flung over a stuffed animal she insisted she was too old for. He stood there longer than necessary, memorizing the moment. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with certainty. He would be able to look her in the eye. He would be able to answer her question, not with clever words or justifications, but with the truth of his actions. He lay down on the couch without changing his clothes, exhaustion pulling him under almost immediately. As sleep claimed him, his last conscious thought wasn't fear or pride, but a quiet acceptance. He had done what he could with what he knew, when it mattered. And sometimes, that had to be enough. The consequences did not arrive with drama. There was no phone call that morning, no message waiting when he woke up in the afternoon, no immediate sign that the night he had spent wrestling with his conscience had altered anything beyond his own sense of self. The world, it seemed, had absorbed his decision without comment. That unsettled him. He woke on the couch to the soft sounds of his daughter moving around the apartment, humming to herself as she got ready for school. For a moment he lay still, listening, letting the ordinary rhythm of home re-anchor him. Then the weight of memory returned. The report, the escalation, the invisible line he had crossed. He sat up slowly, joints stiff, mind foggy. His phone lay where he had left it. No missed calls, no emails, nothing. At breakfast, his daughter talked about her day ahead with the unfiltered enthusiasm that only children possessed. A spelling quiz, a group project, a friend who had promised to trade snacks at lunch. He nodded, responded where appropriate, smiled when she smiled. Outwardly, nothing was different. Inside, he felt like he was waiting for a verdict. The first sign came 2 days later. A message from scheduling informed him that his next shift had been temporarily reassigned. No explanation, no timeline, just a polite note thanking him for his flexibility. He stared at the screen for a long time. This was how it happened, he realized. Not with confrontation, but with absence. With doors quietly closed and opportunities gently withdrawn. He had expected anger, maybe even accusation. Instead, he had been set aside. He felt the familiar surge of fear, sharp, practical, immediate. Rent, utilities, groceries. The margin he lived on was thin enough that any disruption threatened to tear it open. He began mentally rearranging numbers, calculating what could be delayed, what could be cut. That night, after his daughter was asleep, he allowed himself a moment of doubt. Had it been worth it? The question came uninvited, heavy with exhaustion. He thought about how easily he could have chosen differently, how simple it would have been to walk away untouched. The building still stood. No alarms had sounded. No visible disaster had been averted. He sat in the dark, wrestling with the thought that perhaps the world didn't reward quiet integrity. Perhaps it barely noticed it at all. The following week passed slowly. He picked up extra hours where he could, took on short-term work that filled the gaps without offering stability. He said nothing to his daughter about the uncertainty, careful to preserve the sense of normalcy she depended on. She didn't need to carry the weight of his choices yet. Then one afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on his phone. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, measured. The caller introduced herself as part of an internal review team. They had questions about a report he had submitted. Would he be willing to clarify a few points? He agreed, heart pounding. The conversation that followed was unlike any he had imagined. There was no accusation, no defensiveness. Just careful questions, requests for detail, confirmation of timelines. They had found inconsistencies, the caller explained. His documentation had prompted a closer look. Others noticed similar things, she said, almost as an aside. But you were the first to put it together clearly. When the call ended, he sat quietly, letting the words settle. Others had noticed. The thought was both comforting and troubling. It meant he had not been alone in seeing the problem. It also meant others had chosen silence. Over the next few weeks, changes began to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. Systems were reviewed, procedures adjusted, language in internal documents shifted from complacent reassurance to cautious specificity. He heard about it secondhand through people who spoke carefully, as if unsure who was listening. No one credited him publicly, no announcement was made. The story remained internal, fragmented, intentionally understated, but things were different. He was offered work again, not immediately and not with enthusiasm, but it came. The tone had changed, conversations were more deliberate, questions were asked that hadn't been asked before. The culture of effortless dismissal had been disrupted, if only slightly. It wasn't vindication, it wasn't justice in any cinematic sense. It was quieter than that, and perhaps more real. One evening, as he helped his daughter prepare for her school presentation, she asked him if he had figured out the answer to the question she'd asked before one of his night shifts. He paused, considering how to respond. "Yes," he said finally. "I think I have." "What is it?" He smiled softly. "It matters, even if no one sees, because you see, and you have to live with that." She considered this seriously, then nodded, as if filing it away for future reference. Children had a way of accepting truths adults complicated beyond recognition. In the months that followed, life did not transform overnight. There were no promotions, no speeches, no dramatic reversals of fortune. But there was stability, slowly reassembled. A sense that he was not merely surviving, but standing on something solid again. He noticed changes in himself, too. A quiet confidence that did not come from certainty, but from alignment. He had acted in a way that matched the values he wanted to pass on, and that coherence made the daily grind easier to bear. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the many small choices that shaped systems far larger than any one person. He thought about how easily responsibility was diluted, how often it was deferred until it disappeared entirely. And he thought about how fragile that arrangement was, how dependent it was on people continuing to look away. His choice had not fixed everything. It had not made the world safer in any sweeping, permanent way. But it had interrupted a pattern. It had reminded a system, however briefly, that someone was paying attention. And that mattered. One quiet evening, sitting beside his daughter as she read on the couch, he realized something else. Integrity was not a single act or a defining moment. It was a habit. A series of small, often unnoticed decisions to align action with belief, even when the cost was personal. He had taken a job that asked him to be invisible. He had been expected to keep quiet, to maintain appearances, to disappear into routine. Instead, he had chosen to see. And in doing so, he had changed the one thing that mattered most. He had changed the story he would tell himself when no one else was listening. That, he understood now, was not a small thing at all. The consequences of his decision unfolded slowly, almost cautiously, as if the world itself was unsure how to respond to someone who had refused to play his assigned role. There was no public acknowledgement, no announcement that something had been narrowly avoided, no moment where anyone declared him brave or principled. Systems rarely celebrate the people who expose their weaknesses. More often, they simply adjust and move on. For a while, the practical consequences were heavier than the moral satisfaction. Work became inconsistent. Some shifts never reappeared on the schedule. Others were offered with less certainty, less warmth. Conversations that had once been casual grew formal. He noticed how carefully people chose their words around him, as if his presence reminded them of something they preferred not to think about. He understood the unspoken message. He had not broken any rules, but he had disrupted comfort. And comfort, in most workplaces, was valued far more than truth. Financially, life became tighter before it became stable again. He learned to stretch meals, delay purchases, accept help he once would have refused out of pride. None of it felt heroic, it felt humbling. There were nights when exhaustion sharpened into doubt, when he wondered whether integrity was a luxury he could no longer afford. The question returned again and again, especially in moments of stress. Did it really change anything? The honest answer was complicated. The world did not transform, the system did not become virtuous overnight. People did not suddenly start questioning every shortcut they had learned to accept. But something shifted, quietly and permanently. Processes were reviewed more carefully. Documentation became more precise. Deferred actions were questioned instead of automatically approved, not because everyone had changed, but because someone had reminded the system that neglect could be noticed. That reminder mattered. He was not promoted for it. He was not punished outright either. Instead, he occupied a new, ambiguous space, no longer invisible, but not fully embraced. It was an uncomfortable place to stand, yet it felt honest. He had stepped out of the role of passive participant and into the role of witness. Over time, the tension eased, work stabilized, new opportunities appeared, modest but reliable. Nothing about his life became extraordinary, but something essential had been restored. He trusted himself again. He trusted his own judgment in a way he hadn't for years. That trust was not abstract. It showed up in small daily decisions, in how he spoke up when something felt wrong, in how he refused to dismiss concerns just because addressing them was inconvenient, in how he no longer equated silence with survival. The most important consequence, however, was internal. He no longer carried the quiet shame of having looked away. He no longer rehearsed excuses in his mind, just in case someone asked what he had done when it mattered. He had acted, imperfectly and without guarantees, but in alignment with his values. There was no miracle, no reward handed down from above, no sudden reversal of fortune, but there was something sturdier than all of that. There was the knowledge that his choices had interrupted a pattern, however briefly, that he had refused to let responsibility dissolve simply because it was inconvenient, that he had chosen accountability over comfort, even when no one was watching. And that knowledge stayed with him, steady and unyielding, long after the moment had passed. In the end, the story did not resolve in an office or a system or a report. It resolved in the small, familiar space of home, where consequences were measured not in metrics, but in moments. One evening, weeks after everything had settled into its new shape, he sat beside his daughter on the living room floor as she worked on her homework. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft scratch of her pencil and the distant sounds of the city beyond the window. These were the moments he protected most fiercely, the ordinary ones, where nothing dramatic happened, where life simply existed. She paused suddenly and looked up at him. "Dad," she said, "do grown-ups ever get scared at work?" The question caught him off guard. He considered brushing it off with a joke or a vague reassurance, but he stopped himself. He had learned through everything that had happened that honesty mattered most when it was least convenient. "Yes," he said, "all the time. Even when they know what they're doing? Especially then." She thought about this for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. What do they do when they're scared? He smiled, a little sadly. They choose what kind of person they want to be afterward. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to her homework. The simplicity of her acceptance struck him deeply. Children didn't need elaborate explanations. They understood truth when it was offered plainly. Later that night, as he tucked her into bed, she asked him another question, the one that had started everything, though she didn't know it. "Dad," she said softly, "if nobody sees you do the right thing, does it still count?" He didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," he said. "It counts the most." She smiled sleepily and turned onto her side, trusting his answer completely. Trusting him. As he turned off the light and stood quietly in the doorway, he realized that this was the real measure of his decision. Not whether systems improved or jobs stabilized or risks were reduced, but whether he could stand in moments like this without regret. He had wanted to give his daughter security. What he had given her instead was something harder and more enduring, an example. A living demonstration that doing the right thing was not about applause or outcomes, but about being able to live honestly with yourself. The world would not always reward that lesson. He knew that now. But the world didn't need to. Some inheritances were not material. Some were carried forward quietly, through observation rather than instruction. His daughter would grow up, she would face her own moments of uncertainty, her own versions of that question. And when she did, she would not only remember what he told her, she would remember what he did. And long after systems changed and records were archived, and nights blurred into memory, that would remain, the truest consequence of all.